Hello and welcome to the backstory of Session 5, which discusses man's creation as a joint heir of God's kingdom. God, who is spirit, created a physical image of himself in man to reflect his will into his physical world and praise from his world back to himself. The creation described in the first few chapters of Genesis was creation in its infancy. Man's task was to steward creation toward completion and full maturity for the glory of God, working with God, not for God. As one with God and not independent from God, perfectly reflecting God and his will into God's world. Man, or Adam, was promised kingly authority and a priestly ministry to achieve this. However, before God could provide man with dominion over the whole earth, he had to first test him with a small piece of earth, the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, we are introduced to the important biblical principle found throughout all of Scripture of promise, test, provision. If Adam passed the test in the garden in Genesis chapter 2, he would receive the provision promised in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Sadly, Adam failed the test and thereby failed to inherit the promised provision of rulership with God over the whole earth, or we could say Adam failed to enter into God's rest as mentioned in session 3. And as previously mentioned, Adam was created perfect but not complete. Completion could not be created, it could only be encouraged. Promise, test, provision is the means to completion, not just for Adam, but for all of God's people in every generation, as we shall later see. So, returning to the story and the context of the story at this time, we find Moses addressing the children of Israel who had themselves been given a promise. The children of Israel had inherited the promise of Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 and 3, which God gave to their forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This promise included God's blessing, along with the privilege of passing on his blessing to the nations of the world, and in fact, to the entire world of God's creation. Paul reflects on this in Romans 4 verse 13 when he says, Abraham and his offspring, the children of Israel, received the promise that he would be heir of the world. Paul recognized that the promise God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 to 3 was a continuation of the promise given to Adam in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Which Adam had failed to inherit. So, would Israel inherit what Adam had failed to inherit? Or would they fail in the same way that Adam had previously failed? This was the lesson Moses was impressing on the children of Israel by describing the events that took place in the Garden of Eden. Children of Israel, you must love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You must work with God, not independent from him. In this way, you will pass your test that is soon coming, and you will inherit the promise of rulership over the nations and over the whole earth as kings and priests over God's earthly kingdom. The outcome of Israel's test will be looked at in our next session, and we will also explore the other significant times when God's people were confronted with the very same principle of promise, test, provision in their generation. This principle is consistent throughout all of Scripture and is a pathway that God's people journey along to qualify for royal status and divine duties as co-heirs of God's new heaven and new earth and for all eternity. Remember, man was created perfect but not complete. Completeness could only be encouraged. And man's journey to completeness is really what the story of the Bible is all about. God bless, and see you next time.